Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. Today for animal biology we're going to talk about the phyla Mollusca. And in particular we're going to talk about the class Gastropoda. Now molluscans are still within Lophotrichozoa. So they're still under the superphyla Lophotrichozoan. But you see as we progress they're very different than the Coelomorpha, Platyhelminthes, Nemertens, Gastricans, and those phyla are very different because Mollusca, or that phyla, you start to see columns. You start to see the formation of compartments within inside the organism. Okay? So we're going to start looking at what that means for life of organisms or the great deal of life of organisms. All right, so first off, they're triple blastic, as you expect all Lophotrichozoans are. Okay? These guys are coelomates or pseudocoelomates. Okay? So they have a column or a reduced column, which we'll look at. Okay? Very successful. Molluscas, over 100,000 living species currently. Okay? Gastropoda, which we'll talk about, is a class under that. They have about 30,000 species. Okay, we'll get back to them, and we're going to talk about that relationship to the other animals. Okay, again, Mollusca, that phyla belongs under Lophotrichozoa. So when we look at that phylogenetic tree, okay, we already talked about Platyhelminthes and Nemerta and those guys. Okay, one branch. Now we're talking about the molluscan branch, and then we'll talk about annelid branch, and then we'll talk about things like rotifers and whatnot. They're all under that superphyla Lophotrichozoa. All right, so some of the characteristics that are unique and that we start to see progressive characteristics is we start to see the body is divided into distinguished parts. Okay? That partly has to do with that formation of a column, or this ability to compartmentalize the different regions or the different kind of functions of the body: digestive, reproduction, respiratory, etc. So as far as mollusks go, they have two body parts. They have a head-foot region and then what we call a visceral mass. Okay? The visceral mass is the portion of the body that would typically houses the reproductive parts, the respiratory parts, the digestive parts. Now that is often covered with a shell. Okay? Now it's covered with a calcium-based calcareous shell that is excreted by the mantle. And so the mantle will excrete a shell around the visceral mass to protect the visceral mass. Sometimes it also protects the head foot, which we'll see in some of these molluscan groups. So that mantle cavity, along with the visceral mass, that's where you're going to start to see gas exchange, elimination of waste, release of reproductive parts. It's going to be in that opening, that column that's going to form between the mantle and the visceral mass. Bilateral symmetry, we already talked about that. Okay, the column for a lot of the mollusks is reduced. Okay, and we'll look at this. Some, it's not like cephalopods, it's well established, but in some, like gastropods, it's fairly reduced. Okay. For the most part, it's an open circulatory system. So when we're talking about gastropods or bivalves, that's an open circulatory system. When we talk about cephalopoda, okay, these are the squid and the octopus and nautilus and cuttlefish. Okay, and that's a closed circulatory system, which we'll talk about when we get to them. Okay. They're very different groups. Cephalopoda is very different than the rest of the molluscans, so they don't fit the bill with a lot of these things. Radula is usually present. The radula is kind of a rasping mouth part or rasping mouth piece. It's fairly unique in that you start to see kind of the precursor of what you could consider chewing mouth parts. So it's not chewing, it's moving, and it allows for food particles to be broken up. Right? But it's kind of that precursor to having the ability to chew your food. So the body organization, like I said before, first kind of group that has true organization, true actual body types. In this case, they have two. Head-foot region. This is where a lot of the sensory organs are going to be held. So if the organism has eyes, it's going to be in this region. Mouth is going to be in this region. Medulla, okay? But also this region is going to be associated with locomotion, the ability to move either on terrestrial habitat or aquatic habitat. Now, a lot of the features that we start to see in these groups, okay, might be the evolutionary features that came about because of the movement from an aquatic habitat to a terrestrial habitat. We'll talk more about that when we talk about Gastropoda. Okay. The visceral mass, again, this is going to be the second portion of the body. It's normally dorsal to the head foot, and this is going to be where the main physiological features of the organism are going to be housed: digestion, circulation, reproduction. The mantle is what encases the visceral mass. Okay. Often excretes some kind of shell. Mantle cavity is going to be the space between the mantle and visceral mass. And this is going to be where you have, this membrane, which allows for gas exchange or excretion, elimination of waste, etc. Medulla, again, is going to be kind of the rasping mouth parts. Okay, odontophore is going to be this like development of a cartilage ridge that makes it so the rasping mouth parts kind of have more rigidity to them. So it's, I guess you could say it's kind of a precursor to a jawbone. Okay, but we're a long ways off from having bones. Okay, but it's precursor to a jaw at least. So here's this hypothetical look at a molluscan body. Now remember, mollusca includes gastropods, which are snails and slugs, bivalves, which are clams, mussels, things like that, cephalopods, which are like octopus and squid and organisms like that, and a few other classes, smaller classes, like the chitons, there's a couple other that I'm forgetting, but we'll get to them. But at any rate, this is just a kind of a hypothetical situation. Now, some of the organisms don't have a shell whatsoever, so they don't have this kind of mantle excreting shell. Some, the shell is internal, it's not external. Some have a closed circulatory system, so the heart wouldn't be open. So here you can see this heart and this kind of opening. Okay, so there's a lot of situations, but this is kind of the general premise behind a mollusk. They're going to have a head-foot region, which is going to have a mouth, okay, and a way at which it can move. Now, in some cases, they move by wave muscles, allowing them to move forward or in reverse. In other ways, they have tentacles and siphons that allow them to swim through the water column. Lots of situations. Okay, but you have a complete kind of system where you have a mouth, a stomach, digestive glands, intestines, and anus. Okay, you start to have a circulatory system where you have gills feeding, oxygenated blood or hemel to the heart, which then can circulate it around the body. It's not showing you here, but you have a nervous system, which typically will have multiple brains, or ganglia, Sometimes there's 6, 3. In some species there's only 1, or in some groups there's only 1. But you have a nervous system, a true nervous system. So a lot of these organisms have this kind of typical organization. Now, it might not all look the same and be placed in the same manner, but nonetheless, it kind of looks like this. And then there will be, depending on the organism in Mollusca, how many columns or how many open spaces that they have in which gas can be exchanged or waste can be exchanged is really just dependent on the organism. Here's that radula structure. It can look a little bit different in different organisms, but that odontophore cartilage is what allows for it to be rigid. Okay, and you got these rasping kind of, it's kind of like shell pieces. Okay, so it's shell material that has been excreted, which allows for it to scrape off. It kind of looks like teeth, scrape off different material or chew different material. Chew. Kind of in quotes, they're not actually chewing, but they're rasping. They're removing material. Okay, and you have odontophore muscles, which are going to, or radula muscles, which are going to run the system. Okay, and then the radula sac can excrete mucus, so the food particles can be wrapped in kind of a food vacuole and slide down the esophagus in a mucus-filled food vacuole. So that's general shape structure of the radula structure that you find in Mollusca. Now some look very different, and we'll talk about that when we talk about cephalopoda. But first class I want to talk about is the gastropods or gastropoda. Okay, so this is the snails and slugs, a very species-rich group, about 35,000 living species. Kind of put that in perspective. Fish are about 30,000 species, a little bit over 30,000 species of fish on the planet. And, you know, everybody's favorite, most people's favorite, mammals, there's only about 4,000 species of mammals. Okay, so 35,000 species of snails and slugs far outnumber the mammals on the planet. So there's a lot. There sure are a lot of gastropods. So they're very, I guess you could say they're very successful. They've been around for a very long time, and they occupy a lot of ecological niches. They go through something that we call torsion, okay, which is this juvenile phase in which they manipulate their body, and they go through a 180-degree twist. Okay, we'll talk a lot more about this here in a second. Okay, there are some advantages. Now, these are just hypothetical advantages or hypothesized advantages. There's probably clearly some disadvantages. Why this occurs, we're not entirely sure. It could just been a mutation that happened and the organisms live with it, and we still see it, and there's no distinct disadvantage, but there might be some distinct advantages. Okay. So it's a 180 counterclockwise twisting of the visceral mass, okay, and the components within the visceral mass. So the intestines get twisted, the muscles get twisted, the gills get twisted, reproductive parts get twisted, and you'll see what I'm talking about here in a second. Okay. So whether or not it's an adaptive significance, there are some hypotheses around that. The fact that the head foot would now enter the shell first could be an advantage. That clean water is entering the mantle cavity at the opening, so you're not defecating in the water and then having it come back in. So the anus dumps at the back end of the organism now. Okay, but probably the one that's got the most evidence for the significance of the adaptation is the sensory organs are now in the head region of the organism. So at the front of the organism, as it's moving through either a terrestrial habitat or an aquatic habitat, the sensory organs are in the front, so they can sense chemicals, and since we start to see primitive eyes, They can sense through vision, kind of a directional point of view. Okay. All right, so looking at torsion, okay, you can examine kind of this pre-torsion group. The A and C is pre-torsion, so you have this juvenile and this pre-torsion adult, or what the prehistoric pre-torsion adult would look like. It'd be a mouth and kind of a straight tube out. Okay. Again, the ganglia, the nervous system would be straight, just like what we would see in other organisms. Kind of everything straight, clean. Okay. But not very advantageous, because your gills are by your anus, so the water is not going to be clean. That's going to be passing across the gills or through the mantle cavity. Okay. You can see a torsion event where you start to see now the intestines kind of have this twist to them. You start to see that the gills are moved up, the nervous system is all twisted. Okay. There are disadvantages, clearly, because your nervous system is now not as streamlined. But given that these organisms have multiple ganglia or multiple small brains, you can see that, you know, a reaction to a stimuli on this side of the body would just go to this ganglia. It wouldn't have to go to this region in the head of the organism, or the head foot of the organism. So distance really doesn't matter. The gills are now in the front, so clean water can pass through the gills. So there's some distinct advantages. Sensory parts are all in the front of the organism, which is really not showing it here, but all the sensory organisms would be moved to the front of the organism, so you get that kind of piece going. Okay. All right, so let's look a little bit more at some interesting pieces of gastropoda. When we talk about gastropods, this is one of Darwin's kind of favorite groups to kind of talk about and examine. Darwin looked at the coiling process of gastropods, gastropod fossils, and examined the planes of coil. So how many coils did they have? What kind of plane? Was it rigid? Okay. And he looked at some evolutionary trends, and he made a lot of hypotheses about, well, first of all, the age of the earth and about the evolution of species, based a lot on gastropod shells. Because gastropod shells are really easy to find. They're very numerous in regions. There's very numerous fossil, because the shell of the organism will often be fossilized because it's really hard, makes an indentation, and you can see the coiling process. So Darwin examined fossils at the base of a mountain, and then, you know, a little bit up, and then midway up, and then a little bit higher, and then all the way at the top. And he examined that kind of coiling process, and he would make decisions that, you know, or make hypotheses based on the evolution of things like the ramhorn snails, based on kind of the evidence from the fossil. Right? And so a lot can be said about these organisms from an evolutionary point of view. They've been around for a long time. They're species rich. Okay, the coiling process probably has a little bit of something to do with the internal organ change. Okay, being asymmetrical. So a lot of gastropods can be either single gill, or so you got single gilled species and you got double gilled or paired gilled species. So you start to see that organs become more specialized, and then some organs become much more reduced. So you don't actually need both pieces, or you can have an odd number of organs, you know, and still be functional. The locomotion, again. Locomotion is moved from, or used the head foot to move throughout the terrestrial or aquatic environment. Okay? But they use a a kind of a distinctive way to move through the water column. Okay, again, we're going to look at things like worms, which also move with cilia or setae, okay, and they move along a mucus trail. Okay, now the two groups are different in the sense of way that they move. Muscular movement in gastropods come in waves, so they fire a wave of muscles, like the front fire, and then you might have a relaxation of the second set of muscles, and then third fire, etc., all the way down, so you kind of get this undulation movement of waves through the organism so they can move in a streamline, a straight line. When we start looking at locomotion and other things that kind of have the same general pattern, like worms, and they're moving through a mucus trail with cilia or cilia-like structures. Okay? But worms move they fire muscles on each side of their body, so they move in a snaking method, okay, through a system. Okay, so the locomotion is a little bit different. One has a little more control, and you can change speed, increase speed, slow speed, change pattern. Okay, and then one is more streamlined. Gastropods move in kind of a straight line. They don't deviate much from the straight line because their muscles are moving in waves, not firing, so they can undulate through the system. You'll see more about this when we get to annelids, when we talk about worms. Okay. Feeding, for the most part, is going to be kind of detritus and algae or periphyton. So most of them gastropods use the rasping mouth parts, the radula, to scrape material off of surfaces. Sometimes that could be scraping predatory material. So they could be scraping off animal material, either small insects or other gastropods and things like that. Other cases, it's scraping off rotting material, scavengers, so they could scrape up either, decaying animal material or decaying plant material. And then some eat photosynthetic organisms like algae, periphyton, these kind of things, and they scrape it off. That food bolus is going to form. Okay, so that radula cavity or radula sac is going to excrete mucus, and mucus is going to cover the food bolus. It's going to be pushed down the digestive tract. The digestive tract is ciliated, so it has little teeny hairs, which help carry that food molecule in. Okay, so that food molecule or that food mass, that mucus-covered food mass, is what we call a protostyle. Gas exchange, it depends on the organism. Okay, if they're an aquatic organism, they're going to use either a single gill or two gills. Okay? And again, like I said before, the shape of the shell will determine whether or not they're asymmetrical or symmetrical in the internal structures. Okay? So the shell itself, you can tell the difference between one-gilled snails and two-gilled snails. Now for the terrestrial organisms, the gills are lost, and instead the gas exchange happens across the mantle cavity. Okay? So the mantle cavity has to remain very moist, and so they have to have high humidity in the land snails, but nonetheless gas exchange is directly across the mantle cavity through the thin epidermal tissue that occurs around the mantle cavity in order to get gas exchange into the hemel, or the body fluid of the organism. Okay, so now looking at the gastropod structures, okay, you can see very similar to that hypothetical structure that we were talking about before. Okay? The head portion is going to have the sensory organs, so tentacles, eyes, okay, palpate tentacles, or what's sometimes called sensory tentacles around the mouth, radula, okay, They have a cerebral ganglia. They have a main brain in the head foot of the organism. And then they have other brains that are further down, one that controls kind of the digestive region, one that controls the gonad region, etc. So they have ganglia that are possessed throughout the entire body, some that are by the heart, okay, that control the heart, etc. Yeah. But you can see general structure, tube going in, okay, digestive glands, kind of stomach region, and out the intestines, out through the anus. Okay, gonads are going to be in the exact same region as the digestion that occurs. Now, that means that there's no colon. There's really no separation between the digestive tract and the reproductive tract. There is that separation in the respiratory tract. You do have a colon there. You have this opening which allows for gas exchange. So this is a terrestrial organism. There's really no gills. So that allows for gas exchange across the mucous membrane there. Okay, so open circulatory system, we've talked about this before. It just means that there are no arteries, there's no vessels, there's no true capillary beds or anything like that, that blood or hemofluid is going to bathe tissue. Okay? And so nutrients are going to be passing from that hemofluid into cells, tissue cells. Okay? Waste products are going to be passed back into the hemofluid. The heart is kind of a two-chambered heart, has a ventricle and artery. Okay? And that's its job is to just circulate the blood so it can bathe the different tissues. Okay? So is there a lot of mixing? Absolutely. There's a lot of mixing when it comes to nitrogenous wastes. There's a lot of mixing when it comes to blood that doesn't have oxygen. It might be housing a lot of carbon dioxide. And so you're going to get this mixing of waste and nutrients or non-oxygenated regions with oxygenated regions. So it's not highly effective, but it's better than nothing. So again, you're going to get the movement of material around the body. So you're going to get nutrients going to regions and gas going to regions. On top of that, that hemofluid or that blood fluid carries a lot of water, and so you can get regions which can be forced, or that heart can force that hemofluid into regions to make that region swell, which can create this hydrostatic or hydraulic skeleton, so the skeleton-like material. We talked about this before. Nervous system, you got a true nervous system, but now we're talking about these mini brains, small brains, which we call ganglia, that are going to be placed throughout the organism's body. Right? And there's advantages to that because they can react to stimuli in that region. So you don't have to send that stimulus or that reaction to that stimulus from the foot of the organism, okay, or the very end of the organism all the way to the head. Okay, instead it can be sent to the closest ganglia, and you can get a nerve impulse back. Okay, so you can have a decreased reaction time when you have ganglia in that region which the stimuli is coming. Okay. The other thing that we start to see, like I said before, is you get these distinct sensory structures. Okay, we now have an eye that is quite a bit more advanced. Okay, a lot more advanced than the eye that we saw in tubellaria. So if you remember, the eye that we were talking about in tubellaria was kind of just like a open pit, okay, not very deep, with photoreceptive cells, okay, cells that can detect light. Okay. Now we start to see that that pit has kind of become closed, quite a bit more. It's increased in depth. Photoreceptor cells are still, kind of at the base or the bottom of that pit. Okay? But we actually start to see a mucus layer form over the eye, okay, which we're going to, for lack of a better term, we're going to call it a lens. So we have a fully functional eye with a lens now. Now, how good is it? Is not very good at all. It can detect shapes, but there's no color vision or anything like that. And the shapes are nothing more than, they know a snail or a slug will know that, in front of them there's a vertical feature. So a tree, a wall, something vertical. So they can tell that there's an actual shape and it's going up or whatnot. Okay. The other piece that plays a role in that is the statocyst. So statocyst is kind of like a gyroscope inside the organism that tells it the plane at which the organism is on. So if the organism is going to go kind of upside down, the statocyst will also twist, so the organism will know that it's kind of upside down or walking underneath or traveling underneath a branch or something like that. Okay, and then the aspirata, okay, is in the mantle cavity. This helps with osmotic regulation. Okay, and so you get these different sensory structures that we're starting to see in gastropoda. Reproduction is fairly diverse. You can have dioecious or monoecious. Now, just as a general rule of thumb, when you have organisms that are dioecious in aquatic environments, most of the time, okay, now this is just a general rule of thumb, there are internal fertilization in aquatic environments. It does occur. Okay? But as a general rule of thumb, if the organism's in an aquatic environment, whether it be marine or freshwater, most of the fertilization is going to occur externally. And so this is where you start to see dioecious gastropods. Okay? So you have snails or slugs that release sperm and egg into the water column and mixes. Okay? Monoecious individuals often are going to be in terrestrial habitats, especially in gastropods. So they're both going to have male and female parts, but they're not going to self-fertilize, and they're going to copulate, okay? Especially in gastropods. They're going to copulate with each other, okay, to transfer sperm in both directions typically. Okay, so this hermaphrodite is going to transfer sperm to this hermaphrodite and vice versa. Now, depending on the environment, okay, the individual, the species, the genera, okay, the eggs will be transferred either as single eggs or strings of eggs or even masses of eggs. Okay? Majority of the time, these are not watertight eggs, so they need an aquatic environment or semi-aquatic environment, high humidity environment, in order for them to develop. Okay, so even the terrestrial gastropods will still have to lay their egg masses in a very moist region. Okay, so enough water can be transferred back and forth between the eggs. The larval stages are kind of a two-phase larval stage. They have a trochophora larvae, which will be a free-swimming larvae, or most of the time a free-swimming larvae that will swim with cilia. Okay? And now this is not necessarily true for the terrestrial organisms. Okay? And then that trochophora, trochophora larvae will mature into a voligular larvae. Voligular larvae often will look like the adult. Okay, so they'll look very similar to the adult. Okay, but it's kind of another larval stage. And the voligular larvae, it depends on the organism we're talking about, whether or not they're going to be free moving or stationary. Okay? And then they move into the adult form or the juvenile form that looks like an adult. Okay? So here's some reproduction. Okay? These are leopard slugs. So this is a terrestrial slug, terrestrial environment. They have a very unique way at which the hermaphrodites pass sperm between each other. So the slugs will find kind of an overhanging branch. They'll wrap around each other until they kind of got a rope of mucus. They'll drop off the branch and they'll swing in midair. Okay, and then they'll wrap their bodies around each other, and then slugs have, and well, for that matter, most gastropods have a reproductive feature kind of right in the head-foot region, right behind the sensory material. That's where their penis comes out. So their penises will come out. They'll also wrap around each other, and then eventually they will exchange sperm. Okay? So again, these are hermaphrodites, so they would have eggs, but they're getting sperm from another slug, so they don't self-fertilize. Okay? It's kind of a bizarre process by which they go about reproduction, but nonetheless, it's efficient enough that they've existed for millions of years. And in a terrestrial environment, you have to have this kind of internal fertilization, especially in these organisms, versus the aquatic environment, which you have that external fertilization. Okay, so you have lots of different types. Again, you have terrestrial, you have an aquatic, you have predators, you have herbivores, you have scavengers. There's all kinds of species. It's a very species-rich group with lots of adaptations for different environments. Okay? So with that, we talked about the class Gastropoda and generally molluscans. I'm now going to switch and we're going to talk about bivalves. Okay? Still a molluscan and still a lophotrichozoan, but just a few different features, a little bit different. Okay, it's another class that we're going to talk about coming up next.